It's big election test day for Nigel Farage. Next Thursday, local councils go to the polls, and there's that big by-election in Runcorn. Could Reform win Labour's 16th safest seat?
It's election special time, and we're going to be joined by Luke Tryl from More in Common. What he doesn't know about data and polling isn't worth knowing. So stick with us for the Daily Tea.
Cleo Watson, welcome back to the Daily Tea. Just want to say before we get into the meat and potatoes of these elections that are coming up, I want to thank all of our Daily Tea audience on the multiculturalism and immigration episode we did yesterday. Some absolutely fabulous feedback from people who had listened to that podcast. Camilla will be back with us on Monday. She's writing a column today. Do look out for that on The Telegraph, of course, when it's published over the weekend. But we'll be picking up on that feedback from you in Monday's episode. So hold tight for that. Cleo, you've been literally in the room of the Prime Minister when these types of elections happen, with Theresa May and then slightly more distant, but still with Boris Johnson. Why on earth do local elections and by-elections matter?
Well, it does matter who's in charge and who's running things, both on a local and national level. And the by-elections in particular do help with a sense of momentum within the Houses of Parliament. So for Keir Starmer to lose the 16th safest Labour seat will feel like a bit of a blow for him in Runcorn, exactly. I wondered whether it'd be useful for me to just tell you a little bit about what it's like for the Prime Minister around a local election period, because you know, the current Prime Minister obviously has a lot on his plate at the moment, both internationally and nationally. And it's just a brilliant and peculiar part of our system that important people like members of the cabinet really have to pay attention to local elections. So we all know when the date is coming. If they are going to be a central part of the campaign, they will generally launch the campaign. But quite often it will be, you know, for the Conservatives, someone like the party chairman, some months out. And all the cabinet are forced out, but generally very reluctantly, I'm afraid, to go and do some canvassing and door knocking. They'll go and do 3 or 4 visits. Which does seem slightly ludicrous that, you know, Keir Starmer might have a phone call with Donald Trump and then he'll have to shoot off to a sports hall in Leicestershire or something like that to do a visit and do some door knocking while he's there. And then on the day itself, if it's an election that involves them, obviously they'll go and vote. But generally they can get on with things back at the ranch. Although a lot of their team, the special advisors, get sent out to go and do a sort of get out the vote operation. They take a day of holiday to do that because they're such dedicated parts of the party machinery. And then over the course of the evening, the Prime Minister will get the results coming through. They'll often get texts from their political secretary, someone like that. So they get a sense of what's happening so that going into Friday, they will know, you know, is there a surprise result where they get to go and do a bit of a glory tour up in the northeast or something, or do they really need to stay quite quiet? They have to put out a statement at some point saying, you know, these results are, you know, below what we were hoping for and more work needs to be done and we need time to reflect. Various loyal ministers will be put out on the airwaves to answer embarrassing questions. And then if they are particularly dedicated, and this is something Theresa May was very good at, they will get on the phone and they will call as many, particularly heads of local councils who've lost their seats, and they will write to local councillors, and there's actually quite a big operation for several weeks to make sure that every single person who's lost their seat has had something from the party leader, because these people are such an important part of the kind of campaigning machine for the party. When a general election comes back around, you need these people to go out and door knock for you. And whilst they were Conservative councillors or Labour councillors, they were actually salaried to do these jobs. So it was sort of double bubble. They were helpful for the party, but also brilliantly, that actually paid them as well. So it is quite an important and strange and peculiar part of our system that prime ministers and party leaders have to deal with, that arguably Donald Trump will not be having to worry himself over.
You actually were alongside the very important elections that Theresa May had to deal with, European elections that actually were really the death knell of her prime ministership.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously those were a bad set of results for her for various reasons. I mean, just on paper, they were bad for her. But it meant that the sense of goodwill towards her within her own party fell away. And that is actually really important. People want to feel like they're on a winning side. People want to feel like, the figurehead is an election winner, because that's the whole point of them, really. And that's I think what really did for her, and she knew that. She's not a natural campaigner, but she does understand the sort of mechanics of political parties, particularly her own, very, very well, which is why she still goes out door knocking now. She's a dedicated sort of party servant in that sense. And I think more than anything, more than cabinet resignations and, MPs putting out negative tweets and so on, I think it was this sense that enough association chairmen and council leaders and so on had sort of lost faith in the project that she felt she couldn't carry on.
And that's why I think just before we get to Luke Tryl, I think there are just four things for us to consider. I think that point is Kemi Badenoch, if these results are bad, and many are predicting they will be next Thursday, she will be pleading for patience. But the point you make, Cleo, is the party will increasingly lose faith in her if she doesn't seem to be able to be a winner. I think for Farage, Nigel Farage, this is the big test. Has he hit a ceiling at 27%, or is this a stepping stone to increasing momentum to that one-time apparently ludicrous idea that he could be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? I think for Labour, it will all be about rather loftily ignoring whatever the results say, because they're not even a year into their new government. They've probably been given a 4 or 5 year ticket by the electorate. Just get on with it. And then for the Lib Dems, as often, slightly ignored by what might be described as the mainstream London-based media, but they'll just crack on with actually being probably, at this stage, on their own terms, the most successful political party there is in local government. And that will be the thing that we'll all be watching for when the results start rolling in, particularly that Runcorn by-election.
Absolutely.
That is going to be the biggie. Can Sarah Pochin, the Reform candidate, overhaul a huge majority for Labour? And if that happens, that will be the marker that actually all the local elections, whatever happens with them, will be of secondary interest. Luke Tryl, the Executive Director of More in Common, joins us on the Daily Tea. Thanks so much, Luke. Let's kick off with the bigger picture. Let's go to 35,000 feet. We're 9 months after the general election. Just walk us through the four major parties. How are they doing? So you've got Labour, Conservatives, Reform and the Lib Dems. Just give us your overview of the kind of state of the sort of political race at the moment.
Yeah, well, it's an exciting time in politics. Obviously, what we saw at the last general election was Labour getting that big majority, landslide majority, close to Blair's majority, but actually on quite a small share of the vote. And we saw in that election, actually UK politics starting to fragment, to move in lots of different directions. It wasn't just the sort of two-party switcheroo that we are used to in our politics. And basically what's happened since then is that fragmentation has continued. So since the general election, broadly, Labour are down about 10 points in the opinion polls, 9-10 points. So they got about 35%. They're now on around 24-25% in the polling. The Conservatives have basically treaded water. They've lost a few more votes to Reform UK, it looks like. Maybe gained a few votes back, but they're sort of 22-23 in the average polls. I mean, certainly within the margin of error of Labour. And the big gainers have been Reform UK. So we've had Labour come down 9 or 10 points, Reform UK up 9 or 10 points, again to be on around 24-25% in most of the polls. So we're in quite an extraordinary position going into this set of local elections where you've got three parties basically tied in the low 20s. And of course, then you've got the Liberal Democrats on a lower share of the vote, around 13-14, maybe a tiny bit up on their general election performance. But of course, what we know about the Liberal Democrats is even on a low vote share, they're very good at turning that into seats. And then further back, the Greens on sort of 7 or 8%. I think that's quite an interesting question. I had assumed that the Greens would be the main beneficiary of left-wing discontent with Labour by now. That doesn't seem to have happened, but it's one to keep an eye on. So that's the overall state of the map going into these elections.
That sort of left discontent, I think, is really interesting, Luke. Quite shortly after the general election, and of course, one of the big surprises was the fact that Reform UK won any seats at all, beyond maybe Nigel Farage. What appears to be happening, and then after that, there was the first hint of an argument that could Nigel Farage be the next Prime Minister, which I think initially appeared beyond really the bounds of possibility. Is that left discontent actually going more to Reform than to other more traditional left protest parties, which could be seen as the Greens and the Lib Dems?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is if you look at what's happened to Labour's 2024 vote, they're holding on to about 2/3 of it. And you're getting a chunk that's going to say, well, we don't know, we wouldn't vote now. And then it's basically splitting equally between parties of the right and the left. So you're getting, and maybe it's a bit of a misnomer, we can get into it, to call Reform a pure party of the right, but they're losing votes to Reform UK, losing some votes to the Conservatives, but also losing votes to the Liberal Democrats and a few to the Greens and some to independents as well. So it's almost the mirror image, actually, of what happened to the Boris Johnson coalition in 2019. It fragmented, but it fragmented in lots of different ways. But I think very clearly, Nigel Farage is aiming to get some of that left-wing discontent from Labour. What's interesting about Reform voters is, they're basically often portrayed as just more extreme Conservatives. And I think that's a real misnomer, actually. On some issues, they're very aligned with the Conservatives, or are, just degrees of, so immigration, criminal justice, debates about gender identity and sex-based rights. But on other issues, actually Reform voters are closer to traditional Labour voters. So debates around nationalisation, debates around redistribution of wealth there. And then on institutional questions, they're almost in a league of their own, Reform voters. So, abolishing the House of Lords, Reform voters are the most supportive of any group of voters. They're also the only group which is pro-Donald Trump. So it's a bit of a mistake just to think of them on one linear spectrum, which is why Nigel Farage, in the run-up to these local elections, I think put Scunthorpe and nationalisation of those steelworks front and centre, because he knows his potential voters, yes, they're right on social issues, but they actually lean left on lots of economic questions.
Obviously, there's been a lot going on in international news, Luke, but it's really struck me that Reform, and Nigel Farage in particular, has been very careful to stick to national and local subjects. And do you think that he's basically been able to take advantage of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and the governing parties, not distraction, but let's say busyness with running the country and dealing with Ukraine and tariffs and so forth, to look like he's more in touch with, let's say, normal people and average voters?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the interesting thing is, if we think about what might be, and it definitely shows up in the polling, potential Achilles heels for Reform UK, actually relationship with Donald Trump and Ukraine in particular are where Reform finds themselves out of step with public opinion. So it doesn't surprise me that Nigel Farage is downplaying that side. We have, sort of would-be Reform voters who certainly agree with Farage on immigration, who will say things in focus groups like, I just don't know why he's cozying up to Donald Trump, or, I was disgusted by that meeting with Zelensky. It's quite an interesting challenge for Reform UK. On the other hand, I hinted at it with the polling decline Labour stuff, but it's clear some of their domestic decisions being unpopular, particularly around the winter fuel allowance, which people are still bringing up today. But he's got higher marks on the international stage from the public. So the public quite like the way he's handled Ukraine. Interestingly, they tend to see striking the right balance between the US and the EU. No easy line to straddle. So that's an area of strength. But yes, and I think there's a broader question, which is, when you are an opposition party with 5 MPs, not being pulled to international summits around the world, not having to decide, how we save the car industry from tariffs, it's easier to be in permanent campaign mode. And add to that, Nigel Farage is just a very good campaigner.
What does success look like for Nigel Farage on Friday, the day after the local elections and the Runcorn by-election?
Yeah, well, so if we start with that by-election, that is a seat which, I think in lots of ways should be tailor-made to test out how real Reform's momentum is. This is traditionally quite solidly Labour's seat. It's quite a working class seat. It's a very white seat. There are lots of elements there which match your sort of profile of the types of voters who might be going for Reform UK. You add to that the former MP is somewhat disgraced, having hit one of his constituents as well. And I would be surprised if Reform UK don't gain that seat. If they don't gain that seat, it could indicate one of two things. Maybe the polling is slightly overstating Reform UK, or I think perhaps more likely their ground game still isn't good enough, that they've got the enthusiasm and the energy, but they're not able to turn that into, and Cleo will know this very well, the people that you rely on in elections to turn people out, get people to the polls. So that's Runcorn, which I think is a key test on the Labour reform side. If you look to the local elections, largely it's the county council elections. This is deep Tory territory, right? These are councils which are generally run by the Conservatives. They're more rural. When they were last fought under Boris Johnson's premiership, 2021, the real Tory high mark. So there is no doubt that, even in the best case scenario, Kemi Badenoch would be losing a significant number of seats in that election to Reform UK. I think the question is how many? Can Reform hit 500 seats? Can they, actually take control of some councils outright, or do they fall a little bit short of that? And what is the scale of Conservative losses? Is it, 600, 700, I think 700 at the worst end, or actually, the slightly perverse view that, if Kemi Badenoch loses fewer than 500 seats, might not actually be that a bad night for her.
You talked very briefly about focus groups, and I think I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels that there are a lot of numbers flying around, and it's often quite hard to contextualise what those numbers really feel. What does a minus 37 approval rates really mean? It would be so helpful. You've been running several focus groups a week for quite some time now, Luke, and it would be really helpful, I think, to hear some of the kind of key phrases that keep bubbling up. Perhaps just about how people feel in general, but in particular about how they feel towards the Conservatives and Kemi Badenoch, Labour, Greens, and so forth, just to really get a sense of how people are feeling and something more words than numbers, which I always find quite helpful.
And how does it affect, as far as we know, how people would vote in a local election? We were talking, Cleo, before we came up to the studio. What motivates voting in a local election or a by-election, which might be different from the headline numbers we're seeing?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So we start off with the mood of the country. I often describe the mood of the country at the moment as being stuck in a bit of a doom loop. When you talk to people about the state of Britain, they will firstly say they don't think the cost of living crisis has ended. That comes up repeatedly, this sense that they feel that, whatever the official figures say, that things feel like they're getting more expensive, more unaffordable. And the phrase I hear time and time again, or variants of this phrase, is, there's just no money left over at the end of the month for the fun things in life. And I think more than anything else, that's contributing to our sense of national gloom. This is the group who, there's a group who are really struggling. They're choosing between heating or eating group. But there's a group just above that who, I can pay the bills, I can manage, but I can't take the kids on day trips. can't go on a holiday this year. I can't, get, the upgrade to the house I wanted. And so that comes up a lot. The NHS, immigration, people talk about their frustrations there. And so how does that translate into the parties? So on Labour and Keir Starmer, you broadly get a split. So you get a group who say, well, it's not been that long. I'm not particularly happy with what I've seen, but I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt. We did have the other lot for a long time. And then you've got another group who say, well, they haven't done what they promised. We haven't got the change we were promised. They've done things like winter fuel. They've gone after the farmers. The disability benefit cuts have landed quite badly with some groups in particular, not because people in focus groups will often talk about the need to make sure people on benefits deserve them. But interestingly, with disability cuts, almost everyone has a story of someone they know who think really needs the support. So that's where with Labour. With reform, it's interesting, particularly recently, we're getting a lot more people saying, yeah, I quite like what reform have to say. And look, they can't do a worse job than any of the others. We need something different. But, and I wonder if this is a Trump effect or it's something else. For the first time, there's a lot more people who should be sort of Farage supporters, voters going, yeah, I like a lot of what he has to say, but he does just go a bit far, doesn't he? Or he's got quite a lot of baggage. He's been around a long time, hasn't he? Which I think is interesting. It'll be interesting to see if that continues, but it's certainly more than one focus group where I've had that. People who say, like the message, a bit unsure about the messenger. Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives, I think it's basically just been difficult for them to cut through. And the truth is that the response I get most often when I ask about the Tories or the leaders is, I haven't heard anything from them. I don't know who the leader is, which is a challenge when you've got Nigel Farage, who's so good at getting airtime, and Keir Starmer is the one in government. And of course, ordinarily, this would be the period when oppositions go away and lick their wounds, and you wouldn't expect to hear from them. But the reform threat makes it more viable. And then fairly often we will get people making quips about, I wish Ed Davey would come and sing to me or do a stunt in front of me or something as well. So whatever you might think about them, they do cut through.
I do want to ask you about Tory reform, but let's just focus on your points there about Labour. Given that they're not even a year into this government, does next Thursday matter for Labour, or can they broadly, loftily ignore the results, even if they lose a bit and they lose Runcorn? Or is it more like Hartlepool, if we think back to the first by-election that Keir Starmer faced when he got the leadership of the Labour Party, actually a real problem?
Yeah,
I losing Hartlepool.
Yeah, I certainly don't think they can ignore them. I think Keir Starmer is, it might sound odd to say this, but in some ways lucky that it is this set of elections. Next year's elections, Scotland, Wales, local elections in some of the big cities, actually much more of a test for Labour on lots of different sides. But I think once reform gains more council seats, there's that old adage in campaigning world that a councillor is worth two activists because they're embedded, they're committed. It does give them even more of a platform. And I think Runcorn, if it does go to reform, Farage will be trumpeting this as him putting his tanks on Labour's lawn. Flip side, of course, and I think it's really important to say this, that we talk about a volatile electorate. That's why Labour had so little honeymoon. Things can flip the other way very quickly. And you mentioned Hartlepool in 2021. I think, we were expecting, and certainly people like me who study public opinion, was basically expecting a period of long Conservative dominance to follow from that. It was difficult to see Labour getting back into office anytime soon. And, well, we're in a very different world now.
Yeah, I was thinking about the final European elections that we had, because I was still with Theresa May in Downing Street then. And that actually, aside from the last general election, was the last time we saw Nigel Farage with a sort of organised party machine behind him. And the Brexit Party did very, very well, but partly because we were only in the European Union for a matter of a few more months. So why the hell not? I suppose with some of the thinking. I was talking to Kamal earlier about, I live in Wiltshire at the moment, and one of the things that has shocked me somewhat is that it's a big Conservative county, and they're actually one of only 14 councils in the whole of the UK that actually runs a budget surplus. And Kemi Badenoch did not mention that one bit. Instead, she was very much laying the groundwork for a defeat and for disappointed activists and party members and so forth. And one of the things I'm wondering about is, some of this pitch rolling that the party leaders have made. And I noticed Nigel Farage has, tamped down somewhat on his quite boisterous predictions a month or so ago. Does that filter through to some of your polling, some of your focus groups? Is it which is the horse and which is the carriage? Is that they look at some of the polls and think, oh, yikes, this is looking quite bad for us. We should tell people we know it's going to be bad for us so that they're not surprised? Or is it possible if Kemi Badenoch had sort of gone to the southwest and said, listen, we set a very high watermark in 2021 with our vaccine bump, which you're very welcome for, by the way. I was in government at the time, and I think if you all remember, we did very well on that. There are reasons to be positive, and you should stick with me, and I'm a winner. And you can, in some ways, fabricate a bit of momentum by yourself. I feel like by coming in so negatively and pitch rolling like that, she's also made people think, well, she knows she's going to lose. I don't really feel like backing a loser. What have they done well? And the reason I mention being in the southwest is because they actually have a really good story to tell there with councils that have budget surpluses, rather than say Birmingham, which is both bankrupt and covered in bin bags.
Yeah, I think it's a perpetual challenge, right? And I ultimately, I think expectations management is a bit of an elite game. It doesn't really trickle too much down to the public, except for in a general election. So, in the last general election, we'd have people play back to us in focus groups this idea of do we want a supermajority? But in a local election, when I think it's fair to say we three are more engaged on it than the average punter is. Probably less so, but I think there's probably, and this is more for political strategy than me, I think it might be more about the effect it has on your activists in particular, and the risk of leaving them demoralized as well. So, I do think, one of the challenges more generally for the Conservatives is, as you say, how do they pivot to the better bits of their record whilst acknowledging some of the mistakes in office. And it is interesting. If you look at our latest tracker, the Conservatives have regained the lead from Labour on who people most trust on the cost of living, which is quite interesting, right? Given where we were, given the economy was such a big factor in their defeat. And yet it perhaps seems to the public that the Conservatives aren't spending enough time talking about that area of strength, and perhaps spending more time talking about how they deal with one other particular party.
Luke, help us on the big, maybe this is a little bit Westminster-y, but should the Conservatives and Reform work together? Do you get any hints from voters and the focus groups whether generally they prefer the distinct offer from Nigel Farage should be separate from the offer from the Conservatives, or do they more often say, do you know what, these people should just work together because I so dislike Labour or any of the other alternatives?
No, I think the latter is actually very much a sort of political strategist Westminster view. I think that amongst the public, and this is one of the reasons I question why Nigel Farage would necessarily want a merger, the appeal of Reform is that it is new, it is not the status quo, it is doing something different. And for him to ally himself with the party that was in office for 14 years, party with a long history and heritage, I think could blunt some of that kind of outsider mantle that he is trying to pick up. And for the Conservatives, perversely as well, I think there would be risks to an open association with Reform UK, simply because the way to think about it is lots of people who stuck with the Conservatives last year did so because they are small c Conservatives. Reform UK are not a Conservative party, and there is a danger that those kind of pro-institutionalists aren't happy with the merger, and Reform UK don't benefit necessarily either. Now, can the Conservatives win again without getting back some Reform UK voters? I think it's almost impossible. Can Reform UK win without peeling off another rump of Conservative voters? No, I think that would be difficult too, although it depends what they can do from Labour. But I think the debate is around the voters rather than the parties. And the challenge for just sort of thinking you can add them together is, and I said this before, but the person who stuck with the Conservatives in 2024, if you think of the pen portrait, right? You know, the Conservatives, they're low, they're on 24%. It's basically Philip Hammond. It's like a proper Tory, right? It's that should be the pen portrait in your head of the kind of person who still voted Tory last year. Kind of person who voted for Reform UK, the pen portrait, is someone like Lee Anderson, much closer to his worldview and outlook. They are not two people who are necessarily happy bedfellows with one another. And I think that is the challenge. Now, will it get to a situation come the election where you essentially have what happened between Labour and the Liberal Democrats in the last election, which is not a pact, not, still fielding candidates everywhere, but it was fairly clear who was the main opposition to the Tories? I think that is a more probable solution to it for the Conservatives and Reform UK. But again, that's not without risks as well.
But also that does depend on both parties having ground campaigns that are in good shape. Reform is obviously a very new party, and it remains to be seen quite how well their operation runs. And the Conservatives, CCHQ is running out of money. They'll have a lot of very disillusioned members and potentially 500 or so seats of very cross former councillors as well. So that obviously is a very important piece of the puzzle that, amongst some of the data doesn't necessarily get picked up. There's a lot of personalities and individuals involved.
Yeah. Luke, before you go, I just wanted to ask you, Nigel Farage said he had a 45%, rather accurate number, chance of winning the next election. With that fiver in your back pocket, what do you think the chances are? What bet would you put on Nigel Farage winning the next election? I mean, is it, as I said, when it was first sort of posited as even an outside chance, most of us, frankly, and I include myself, thought that is faintly preposterous. I no longer think that. I just wondered where you are on the could Farage be the next Prime Minister in the system, first past the post system we have.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm not going to be drawn on a specific defendant, certainly not this far out. What I will say is, if we, let's assume it's whenever it is, May, June 2029, and we wake up the next day, or more likely we've been up all night, and Nigel Farage emerges as the next PM, it wouldn't be the outcome I necessarily expected right now, but would I be surprised and shocked? Probably not either.
Luke Tryl, more in common. Thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea.
Thank you.
I thought great analysis there from Luke, as ever. This idea of reform not really being left-right. I think he is right. I cannot see Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage formally being able to bring their parties together. It's not only the Philip Hammonds of this world, it's the Mel Strides of this world, it's the Jesse Normans of this world. Kemi Badenoch has a lot of very centrist, small C traditional Conservatives in her shadow cabinet who would find it, I would say, almost impossible to work with Nigel Farage, Lee Anderson, Richard Tice.
I think it's also interesting to consider that, bunging both pots together would potentially get you to, 28% and 28%.
Yeah, 56%, yeah.
But actually that it actively wouldn't work, and it would put voters for both groups off. So, it's not just that the mass might feel like it adds up, but the chemistry certainly doesn't. You could end up with a bit of an explosion.
Yesterday, we heard from Nigel Farage in Dover. Our producer, Georgia Cohen, was there. And after she asked the question of Nigel Farage about multiculturalism, which so many of you responded to, and Camilla and I will be coming back to that in Monday's edition of the Daily Tea, she actually spoke to some of the reform campaigners who were at that Dover event. Let's hear what the mood music is from them.
It just feels right. It's an instinctual, almost gut emotion to be part of reform. I feel disenfranchised by both the Tory and the Labour governments over the many years, and just Nigel speaks for me. Nigel's understated what I've experienced on the street from talking to the electorate. Virtually unanimously, everybody wants a change, and they're looking for reform to do it. And so I think come May the 1st, we will be pleasantly surprised, I think, by the change.
I think for too long, the previous governments have made pledges and gone back on every single one of them. Dover is the most important town in this country, strategically, where the illegal immigration issue, starts. Over the years, we've lost all our industry, all our mines were closed. We need our mines. All our seamen were sacked during the P&O strikes. Then the Herald sunk. We've had major issues, major tragedies in this area that have affected it. It used to be thriving. The pubs were full every night of the week. People spilling onto the pavements. Everybody had money. Everybody had a job. When they opened the borders in 1993, we lost thousands of import-export jobs. There's only a few companies left. Dover was massively thriving. Everybody had money. The town has shrivelled. Half of it's boarded up. It's a mess. Dover Council don't help. I don't know what they're playing at. It would be nice to see it pick up once again and become thriving. And the whole country needs industrialisation. We need to be self-sufficient. We're an island. Our borders are the easiest to protect. We've already got all the laws in place to do these things. Nobody's employing these laws. This country needs reform. I don't see how anyone can twist anything he said today or make an issue with any of it. He's not a racist. It is not a racist party. It's patriotic, and I don't see why anybody's got a problem with it. And I'm really pleased to hear what he said on immigration, on the housing, all the issues that this government have caused and successive previous governments. Nigel's covered all of them today, and it was a fantastic speech as ever. I think we're going to do really, really well. I've been out leafleting, and I've not had a single adverse reaction from anybody. I think we are the silent majority, and I believe that the Labour government and the Conservatives are in for a massive shock. Can't wait for the results to come in on May the 1st, and moving forward, I think that people that aren't fans at the moment will wish that they had voted reform and realise that it's a good party, it's a party that's got this country's interests at heart. What can I say? I can't wait.
Really interesting there, and I think there's a lot of this feeling across the country of the left behind and things were better in the past. The era before the financial crisis, when we had average growth of 3 or 4%, people did have more money in their pockets at the end of the year compared with the beginning of the year. That has all broken down, and that is just reflecting that idea, which is where a lot of Reform UK support comes from, which is things aren't as good as they used to be. And then the connection, some would argue wrongly, but the connection with mass migration being the reason for that problem.
I think also in our first Vox Pop there, the gentleman talked about it being an instinct for him to have joined Reform, and it shows one of the elements of campaigning that Nigel Farage really gets right, which is that it's emotive, and it's this sense of belonging and feeling like you're on a kind of winning team with someone who doesn't necessarily have policies or, on potholes and bin collections and, national insurance that you care about, but that they have a sense of ideology and philosophy that you're on side with. It's almost too much at times, because you just realise the whole electoral map is sort of glowing at any time with some kind of by-election or council election going on. But The thing that really came out to me was that regardless of what the polls are saying, and we have these very sophisticated pollsters now who do from time to time get proved wrong, so much of the movement next Thursday into Friday will be about the kind of nuts and bolts of these political parties, how their membership is feeling, how many people they can get out campaigning and canvassing and leafleting and door knocking. And it's one of the things I really quite love about local elections is it really does come down to that. Can you be persuaded by the little person in a rosette who's knocked on your door and said, this is what I can do for you in your immediate surrounding area? This is how, I've been serving you already for the last 4 years, or how we can do better. And, coupled with that, I think, is the reaction in SW1, where I think, we're so interested often in what's going on in Trumpland, or whether Rachel Reeves is in trouble, or, what latest shenanigans are going on in the House of Parliament, that they're quite a levelling way to remember how people are actually living. And I think combining that with some of the feedback coming out of Luke's focus groups about how people are actually coping, what they're interested in, this sense of fun in life just being gone for the moment. I'm an embarrassing Harry Potter fan, and there's this scene in one of the books where the Prime Minister is visited by the Minister for Magic, who basically says there are these things called dementors all over the UK, and they're making everyone really miserable. And it just feels a bit like we're in a dementor attack for poor old Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch, and the only person for whom there is, an opportunity for excitement and joy at the moment is Nigel Farage. Puts him in the biggest risk point, though, because he's kind of the only person that can lose next Friday now.
Absolutely. Has he got that magic wand? I think Farage has set himself a big test. Is 27-28% in the polls a ceiling, or a position of growth to going to 30% and 35%? So is it the end of where they can get to, or is it just a stepping stone to even greater momentum? And then I think the second thing is that voters are not looking for Reform and the Conservatives to work together. It will be interesting if Kemi Badenoch does badly and the Conservatives do badly. How much will leadership chatter increase? You have an interesting position on, what do you think about Jenrick and Robert Jenrick, and is he on manoeuvres, and what should he do? I just want to finish with that point.
I mean, anyone who's rumoured to be on manoeuvres is on manoeuvres, just to say. Get that out there in Ed Stone. But I think it would be a mistake for him, if he were on manoeuvres, to act now, regardless how badly it goes for Kemi Badenoch next week. I think there are more opportunities for her to, unfortunately for her, absorb some of the kind of poison and some of the difficulties, particularly within fundraising within the party and membership and organisational problems. There's a lot to be done. If I were him, I wouldn't want anything to do with that. And I'd be looking at this time next year, which will also coincide with an extremely, extremely difficult set of local elections for Keir Starmer, which could really tear his party apart. That will be the time to capitalise, kind of get both at the same time.
When people start listening to the Conservatives again. Cleo Watson, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea for this election special. I'll be back with Camilla Monday, 5 o'clock.